Welcome to the Surfcast podcast, your weekly source for surf fishing discussions, tactics, interviews, news, and more. The Surfcast podcast is hosted by Jerry Audet and Toby Lapinski, two of the most dedicated and obsessed surf fishermen that you will ever meet. The tide is up, the wind is at our back, so let's hit the surf. Hey there, welcome to the Surfcast podcast. I am Toby Lapinski.
And I am Jerry Audet. And today we are going to be discussing the 2023 October new moon. The October new moon for 2023 was in the middle of the month, and we're just going to give you a few thoughts of some things that sort of defined the moon for us. You know, Toby, a few things happened. A lot of things happen every single moon, of course. But there are two things in particular that really stand out to me from my experience with this moon, which again for me was unfortunately kind of disappointing. Plenty of fish, but not a lot of size, frankly. And the first thing is, very late, actually coming off of the moon, I got into a bite of very fussy fish. They were very, very picky. They were in a very, very small, specific spot on a very, very large stretch of beach. I was fishing some sand beach, and by sand beach, I mean a huge stretch of sand beach. And I found a really nice sandbar, not even maybe a half a cast off the beach, really close. The trough was right up against the beach, and it extended for a really long period in pretty much either direction. The thing that I found was you would look at it and kind of go, well, the fish are probably going to be here in the trough at the edge of the bar. Maybe they're on the outside of the bar, and they're going to be kind of cruising, right? Well, what I found instead was these fish were all stacked up on almost a sub-bar on the inside of the bar. There was this one little spot where the sandbar almost extended closer to shore. And then what happened was that pinched the current closer to the beach, increased the current, and the fish were stacked up actually on the wrong side of what I would consider. They were on the down current side, not the up current side, which was kind of interesting. But the whole point is, it took me a long time to find them. It took me a long time to figure out if it worked or not, this spot, and then what they wanted. I got a couple of bumps on a couple of different things, needles, actually a redfin. And that made me kind of stick around because I kept going, man, this is a good spot. They gotta be here. I was really oh my God, look at this. It's like making me have a heart attack. The structure is so good, So I ultimately settled on a Super Strike darter, which anybody in the surf is going you idiot. Why didn't you just start with that, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, why are we messing around with a redfin when we could be using the Super Strike? So I ended up using the darter, started getting hits right away, but I still wasn't hooking up, so I ended up sort of tuning the darter on the beach to get it to swim just perfect. The water was super shallow. I'm guessing less than 3 feet, maybe even 2 feet, but it needed to dig, it needed to swim. And as soon as I figured out, it was fish every cast. And they were not very big. They were, quite frankly, fairly small. I think I maxed out at 18 pounds. But it was fish every cast once I figured it out. And, for me, it really reiterated this one very clear example where I really like catching fussy fish. And when the fish are fussy and you have to really dig in and figure it out, it makes up a lot for size sometimes for me. Sometimes it doesn't. And, if I wasn't closing out my season because I was traveling, I probably have a little bit different attitude about it because I would have been oh man, shit, why isn't these fish not bigger? And, this is a waste of my time a little bit. But, it felt good, really good to sort of end on a high note. But I kept thinking I think a lot of guys would find this annoying and frustrating. And I know that a lot of anglers wouldn't be patient enough to even discover it and stick with it and find it. And in fact, there was a couple of guys who came and went, which in of itself was a little bit strange because I don't typically see anybody, but they came and went. I mean, one saddled right up kind of close to me. It was making me feel kind of irritated, get away from me. And they didn't catch anything. And that could be the plug they were using, but I think it was ultimately a lot about that they weren't really digging into what they were seeing in front of them. And again, for me, I'm not about catching fish in a blitz. That doesn't do it for me. I like reeling in fish and fighting big fish, but ultimately catching a big fish is like a treasure hunt. It's like the accomplishment of just checking that box and like getting it in. And for me, that's what catching fussy fish is too. It's they are outsmarting me. They're being tricky. And if I can fool them, that to me is the high. And that's why I like fishing my own spots too. I don't like running around to all kinds of different spots. I like digging in and figuring it out. And I had a ball. That's really what I'm trying to say. I had a lot of fish. I mean, I must have had 75 or 80 fish, probably more than that over a couple of nights. I don't count, obviously. But finding those fussy fish, figuring it out, then I had to move. I had to walk almost a couple of miles. Once it shut off, I found them again, and then it turned into a sluggo bite, and they were in this extremely shallow, clear water. And, figuring out the 3/8 ounce head was better than a 1/2 ounce head, and the 9-inch worked better than the 7.5 inch because of the sink rate, and blah, 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 blah. It was just fantastic. And like I said, I'm leaving to actually do some Florida stuff. And so this sort of closed out my season, and I thought, there's a lot worse ways to finish up my season. So, Toby, I know you are a tried and true 100% trophy hunter. I think that that's fair to say. I mean, I really do. Yeah. Whether you want to say it or not, I will. So how do you feel about fussy fish?
Frustrated, because I mean, we've fished together enough times. You see like what's in your plug bag versus what's in mine. So I look at yours and I get all like anxious that there's too much stuff in there, and I wouldn't be able to go with in a night like that. So I'm only running 8-10 plugs, whatever, in jigs, etc. So when I run into fussy fish, I cycle through probably almost even faster than I normally do because I want to figure them out. And I'll get frustrated quickly, but I'll give up on them quickly. I a lot of times will not stick it out. I love it when I can figure them out within my arsenal that I have, but I don't too often go to... I won't have the selection that you went through on the initial example, getting to this, to this, to this, to this, to the darter, knowing where you were. I probably wouldn't even have had the darter in there in the first place because I'm not just going to carry a plug to fill a space. I'll leave one of my 3 tubes with 1 plug in it if I've put into my bag what I kind of perceive are the right things that are going to cover the situation. So I probably miss out. I know I miss out at times on discovering that wild card plug that could have worked.
And meanwhile, I'm jamming every single tiny millimeter of space between the tubes, and I'm putting them in my pouch and my, I got to take these 2 backups. I'll just stick them in the pouch in the back, not out, not in the tube, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I enjoy it. I really only enjoy those fussy fish when I can figure them out, which is kind of like logical. Fussy's gonna piss you off, but I sort of self-defeating of not figuring them out enough times because it's sort of in my nature to just go through it, go quick, and I'm always willing to call it an early night, so that helps too. I mean, would I like to have the extra plugs and put more time in? Maybe if I was planning an all-nighter, I'd be more likely to jam it in, jam that bag up. But if I know I could go for 10 minutes of fishing if nothing's there and bail versus sticking around for 2 hours, that sort of also weighs in on how I build my plug bag. So it weighs in on my reaction to those kind of fish too.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm not going to suggest that this is a better trade-off, but I think that has something to do with you have much easier access to water than I do. Mm-hmm. I have to travel every night. So I have to drive, an hour is pretty much that's the closest I can get. Anywhere between an hour and more than 2 to my spots. So I always try to make it at least 1-to-1. So if I drive for 3 hours, I try to fish for 3 hours. It never works out that way. I always end up fishing less than I end up driving most of the time. So for me to go down and in 20 minutes be like, it's not going to happen. It's like, I feel that way all the time. I felt that way the other night. The moon was so bright, it was super calm. The water was way too high because we're coming actually into the full moon practically now. And I was like, well, this was a waste of an hour and 45 minutes of driving because I should literally it's been 30 seconds and I'm ready to leave. But I stick it out for 3 hours, don't catch anything anyways, and then go, why didn't I just leave? But that's also what forces me to kind of keep going, is what I was saying. Versus you can be like, well, it didn't work, and tomorrow I'm going to come back and I can just keep coming back over and over and over and over and over if I want to. Or go to the next spot.
And I mean, certainly using that comparison, when I do go to spots that require more of a commitment to drive to, then my plug bag does look a little different. If I drove, 2 or 3 hours to get to a spot, get to an area, then sure, I'm going to put a little more effort into maybe grabbing a couple of those what ifs, those just in case, those wild cards versus, if it takes me 10, 15, really, I'd say 45 minutes is my cutoff, which is most of what I'm doing. If it's under that, granted 45 each way on the top ends, an hour and a half of driving. Even if I fish for 15, 20 minutes, it's not 1-to-1, which in my head I try to balance, like you said. But I can say, hour and a half of driving, I know 20, 30 minutes, it's not worth it. I could be asleep. I'm out. I'll come back tomorrow.
Yeah, and then when you're going to drive really far, you put wacko stuff in like that Yozuri swimmer that you got that friggin' 47-incher on or whatever and friggin' show up. You're the only one that has anything like that. And you show up and catch the biggest fish, and we've been hammering that beach for weeks. You show up and out fishing us all because you got that damn thing.
That plug's treated me well, though, in that scenario. So that probably started out a couple of years ago as a wild card for sure. Actually, I can remember back when I first started throwing it in that area. It was sort of a wild card. It was new. I was like, I'll try. It worked, and quickly realized this is a top 6 in this scenario, this location. So
yeah, I still don't have one. So I knew I needed to get one. So that's one of the top things I saw. So what happened for you?
I always come into these new moons in the fall with super high expectations, goals of doing something. Maybe I haven't achieved, A, B, or C on the season yet, and I'm banking that moon's going to be it. We're good. It's coming. And this one was, I don't know, coming into it, I had some stuff I wanted to accomplish, wanted to get done, but I'd also been playing around with a couple of new lures this year. Not a whole lot, but enough from time to time to say, and because I've accomplished a few of my goals already, that I was willing to try a little something different. So went out one of the days leading up to the new, and conditions were right. Conditions were what I would want. On that moon, I had the right wind, I had just enough surf, everything. I was psyched, and I started throwing my usual stuff. And I got into a couple of fish, and I was like, all right, I know there's some life. And then I started playing around with that new lure I was playing with. And it was crazy how well I did. 3, 4 fish in a row, quality, 20-pound class, upper 20s. I forget exactly what ended up topping out. But then I'd switch back to my standards. Not so much. Maybe a hit. Maybe a fish. Definitely on the smaller side. And then I go back to that new one. It was kind of this back and forth like I do a lot of times of trying to really dial in the bite. But now I was throwing in this thing that I've never really fished in this spot. And like I said, my standards were just not working. I mean, my standard plugs, the things that in past years, past trips, filled my bag. That's all I would bring. And if they didn't hit on those 2 or 3 things, I assumed nothing was there. Had that been this night, maybe I could have ground it out and pulled something. But the lion's share of the success came on this new plug, and I was psyched. I mean, I got in my truck at the end of the night. I texted that I was coming home, and then I think I sent you a text before I even drove away saying, this is what happened on this because it's something you've been pushing me, a lure you've been pushing me to play around with. And I think you gave me the one that I have like 2 years ago, and it's had some casts here and there, but I didn't give it its due try until now. So I was psyched. I saw the next night was similar conditions, even better. I'm salivating all day long. We've got the same conditions. I had what I had last night.
Yeah.
It's going to be as good, if not better. And as it turns out, it never is. Everything looked the same. I mean, wind. It was actually, one night darker. It might have been a night or two before the moon. So realistically, in my brain, I'm writing this script as it's going to be better than what I had the night before.
Yeah.
And I fished through the same stages of the tide. And whereas, actually, I think I wrote it down. I had 17 fish the previous night, quality fish. I had 2 on this night, and they were rats. They were little, like, surf-em-in schoolies. And I just could not figure out what the difference was, what had happened. I threw the traditionals. I threw the new. I went back and forth. I changed colors on the traditional stuff to see if that was what it was. I went through all of my entire playbook. I threw everything in because I was 24 hours removed from a great night. and it just was not happening. And it took me a while to sort of figure out what I could lay down as the cause for this. And at some point it kind of hit me that, that's fall fishing. The fish
That's right.
are on the move. They should be there one night to the next, or they shouldn't because you don't think they're going to be, but they just can or can't be there because, like I said, they're moving. They're making their way from their generally northern summer and late summering grounds to where they're going to hang for the winter, whether that's the mid-Atlantic if they're going all the way down, whether it's the rivers they're wintering over. And I just essentially got lucky on that night.
That's
the
right.
first one that I was there the night they were in that spot. And I, for instance, hadn't gone 2 nights ago, maybe they weren't, and then, gone both sides of it and missed the right night. The fall can be as close as that, as being just on that one night, which, for better or worse, means you gotta go when you can. You gotta put it in. If you think there's a chance of something being there, you gotta get the motivation. But on my flip side of my brain, always that gives me the excuse, well, tonight's the night they're not there. That weather could be the same, the conditions could be the same, the weatherman could say it's gonna be this and that, and it's in your playbook as this is what it's gotta be. Do you see that kind of a thing with the weather, with the conditions, with the fish moving through?
I certainly do. The fall can be extremely frustrating for that specific reason. I know this really points to the fact that you got to have good spots and stick with them. Stick with them through the blanks. I know a lot of my associates, I guess that's the way I would say it, who are, more casual than you and I, because that's basically everybody, right? Because this is practically our life. They don't get a fish for a night or two and they're out for like a whole week or more. And in the fall, that's really tough. That's a tough way to be successful because look at what just happened to you. Mm-hmm. If you had fished the night before that night, maybe you would have done well, maybe not. You had that good night, but what if you had gone somewhere else and then been like, oh, that place sucked. I'm going to go to this other place the next night, and then showed up and there was just those 25 inchers. Right? Yeah. You would have been like, wow, this spot's, forget it. I'm not coming back here this fall, which is what a lot of guys would do, which is why it's so important, I think, for all levels, but especially if you're a beginner intermediate in that level, but really for all levels, to stick with stuff as much as you can without getting too stuck on it, which maybe we'll do a season recap and I'll tell you about why that was one of my biggest mistakes of the whole year. But yeah, that's one of the things. I want to ask you a question, though.
Yeah.
Of course, we're being vague about the new lure because we don't want anyone to know what it is. But what I want to ask is, what makes you choose a new lure? Like, what was it that you were like, besides just me telling you it was good, and you seeing it in action a few times, but like, what is like just one or two things that you're like, okay, this was what makes this plug, it's going to get a coveted space in my bag. I'm going to have to add this weight to my shoulder. You mentioned it. I mentioned it with the Missouri thing that you used on the Cape. And then this other thing that you're using more locally, why? What sort of, I know there's tons of factors, but is there just a couple of things?
Yeah. When I get something new, a new lure that I want to add in, and by new, I'm not saying just new to the market. It could be something that was around for a while and it's just new to me. Like real quick example, glide baits were around for a long time and I resisted them for a while and then I added them in after everyone else already discovered them. But so that was, again, a new thing for me at that time.
Same for me.
I'll play around with something new to me, meaning I'll go out during the day and I'll look at what it does. I'll get a quick idea of how this thing swims, how it sinks. I'll get a quick idea how it holds up in different currents, different conditions. So then I'll start adding it in places that sort of match up where I thought it looked best, where it swam the best, where it held the best in my daylight testing. And so then at night I'm using it in places that sort of mimic that. And if it works, okay, and then I'll add it in different scenarios, because I see it working at my test location, which gives me a variety of conditions in one spot. I might not quite have it all covered. So I'll then, if it worked really good in a hard current at my test, I'll start off fishing in a hard current. But I'll also go to spots that are calmer, less of a sweep, maybe deeper, maybe shallower. So I really try to pepper it in from time to time in different conditions and keep track of what my results were. And that's how it either gets that coveted slot or sort of gets relished off to the side. And with this lure, that's what it was. I peppered in here and there, and it wasn't initially, my initial perception is that it was going to work in conditions A, B. Those were the two spots. And that's where I was fishing. I got some fish, had one really nice fish on it, but no consistency to it yet. And then I added it in based on observations with you to this other kind of scenario. And that's where it started producing. So it wasn't my initial perceived best scenario for this lure, but I tried it in there and it worked. Now, granted, the sample size on that success is limited at this point. It could have been a freak occurrence, but just the fact that it outproduced those traditional for that spot lures so drastically. It's high on my list now when I go back to that spot to continue to pepper it in and get more experience on it. So, it's a process adding something into my bag, because in reality, one thing goes out, and one thing goes in, something's coming out.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't just add and keep stacking stuff in there.
Well, you have finite space anyways. I mean, what are you going to do?
Yeah, and I don't like carrying stuff that I don't use. When I first switched to refining what I would carry, that was my big, that was my first step, was if a lure went for a walk 2 or 3 times without being cast at a certain spot, it never went back there.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, except for maybe once in a while I'd throw it in and be like, hey, let's finally try this thing. But I try to, it's the easiest way for me to keep it limited, and that's how a plug will step into rotation or fall out or not get in the first place.
That's right. I try to do that too, but I am totally guilty of having a couple of plugs that I consider to be emergency backups, and there's a couple of them that live in my bag all the time, and maybe we'll talk about that at some point. Maybe I'll talk about that. I try to keep that a little bit to myself, but maybe we'll talk about that in a future edition. So, so thanks for answering that. Yeah. I think that makes sense. It's very similar to what I do. One more thing I noticed about this moon, forecast. Mm-hmm. Man, they botched it. And, you're going to get this a couple of times every single year. And, usually it's like one night and then, it's fine or whatever. But I don't know about you, Toby. I do know about you. I'm doing that for the audience. I don't know about you, Toby. I know exactly, to everyone listening. But for me, my spots are a science. It's not I go down to the shore and I start casting. And maybe we'll talk about that in the future too. If I see you get out of the car, walk down the shore and start casting, I know that you probably don't know what you're doing, because you're just randomly casting, if that's what you're doing. Unless there's like literally a spot like that I don't know of, where you just get out, walk in a perfectly straight line, and then start. Anyways, that's not the point of this. My spots are science. If I go to spot A because it's a south wind on an incoming tide, if I go there and it's an east wind, I might be screwed, and I probably am. That's a really good example, actually, south to east, because those usually correspond with different sort of weather patterns completely. Mm-hmm. And if I go and they say it's going to be 15 knots, and it ends up being 30 or 0, I also could be in very serious trouble. And I'll tell you, there was a 3-night stretch that I fished right on top of the moon. I think it was right on top of the moon. I'm a little bit fuzzy now already. Where it was like one night it went east to northwest or something, and then it turned like west or south. I can't remember. But it did this huge circle. There was never supposed to be east in it at all. None. Mm-hmm. And actually, I kind of like east. But then when it swung all the way around, which I can't remember if it was supposed to do that or not. I'm not getting the details exactly right. But I couldn't believe it. And I was like, I'm out there going like, I wouldn't have even come to this spot. I would have gone to a completely different spot. And I don't actually know about you. I'm not going to speak for you, but I really am a tidal fisherman. So tide is like the most important thing. But wind temperature and wind velocity, how strong the wind is very important. If it's supposed to be 5 knots out of the west and then it's 5 knots out of the north, that probably doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But they botched it multiple times. Another night I went out, and you had this experience with the fly rod, so you were really screwed. I went out. It was supposed to be 4 to 8, I think, and it was blowing. We were looking at buoy data. It was like 25 knots gusting over that. And it was a little bit different direction. It was close. But it was even a little bit different direction when they said. It was wild. They didn't even get it close. It wasn't even close.
And there was a lot of different... There was enough, especially where I was, where, the strength they were off on was bad, but because it then also went to the direction it did, made it even worse where I was, where I'm trying to throw a fly rod with, a giant beast fly into a headwind of 20, 25. And if I hadn't put so much energy into just getting my butt out the door that night, because it was, hectic work, everything else, son's baseball, that kind of stuff, and I just needed a night out. If this was a simple walk-in, walk-out spot, I would have bailed before I even touched the water. But I got there and just said, I'm going to try to power through, and also relearning, how you want to call it, my fly experience in the salt. It was good to have one of those experiences to chalk it up to in the logbook. When it is this, in capital letters, don't go.
Never, 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 never.
Yeah, that's in there. Again, bold capital letters in the notes. Do not go when it says it's this.
Yeah. Of course, if it had been the 6 knots it was supposed to, it would have been fine. But like you're saying, maybe getting that 20 reiterated, like this is a absolutely no-go. This is a non-starter, as they say. That's for sure. Crazy forecast in the fall. Again, fall's pain in the ass. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast podcast. You can find out more about the podcast and find more episodes at surfcastpodcast.com. And be sure to check us out on social media at the Surfcast Podcast.